Hi, welcome. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications. A couple of days ago, I was at the JCC for Temple Shir Shalom Shoresh in Minnie Nathan and Joe Leapson's sixth grade class. They're studying the Holocaust, and they invited Holocaust survivor Edith Maniker, and she came and told her story. I was able to catch it on camera so generations could hear her story.
My name is Edith Maniker, but everybody else calls me Auntie Edith. So I feel as if I have met some of you before, and the story I'm going to tell you it's not a make-believe story. It's my life, and this is how I grew up. I was born in Leipzig, Germany, the youngest of two children. My sister was 7 years older than me. Went to a Jewish school because the law in Germany at that time was Jewish children were not allowed in public school. So we went to Jewish schools. I was lucky. Even though it doesn't look like it now, I was a redhead. And I've got blue eyes. I wasn't what is called looking Jewish, but of course I went to a Jewish school with my parents there. And we managed. I had an uncle who lived in Leipzig as well, who worked for what I would describe as something like Jewish Federation here. And my uncle managed to get passenger for us to go to England on the kinder transport. My mother handled it in a very clever way. She said, Paula, who was my sister, is going to go to this place called England. She's going before you, but when you get there, both of you are going to be so lucky. You're going on a wonderful vacation. It'll be about 2 weeks, and at the end of the 2 weeks, you will see your father and I. When you're 7 years old and your mother tells you something, you believe it. None of the kinder transport children who went to England, none of us ever thought we would not meet our parents again. I was sent to a distant relative of my mother's. They weren't rich, and you could tell they weren't poor, but they were on the verge of it. Very little furniture, and also at that time I came from an observant home, and I went into this home where nothing was observed. It was very, very different from me, but my mom said after I went to England, the war was declared. And as soon as it was declared in England, everybody worried about the children. In London, especially where I was living, there was going to be an air raid. We had to learn about the air raids and how to take care of sitting in an air raid shelter, very often overnight. I had a wonderful group of parents and teachers who sort of looked after me in a way. I know none of you know this song, but the most famous song that I ever learned was Polly Put the Kettle On. And that's how I started to learn English. Very popular in England. War was declared, and the government evacuated all school-age children out of London. They thought it would be bombed. Went to a little village. 2 Gentile ladies lived in this home where we were put. And I was taken to church. It's very interesting, but it's not my religion. But I learned very quickly, and the way to handle most things is to keep your mouth shut. And you learn something every day, a little bit. Life was completely different from me. My sister lived with this woman who was a cousin of my mother's, and I lived with the cousin's children. The 1930s are a long way away, but I learned something after all these years that I didn't realize. The people I went to, they didn't like me. And it took me all these years to finally figure it out. My grandmother, who lived on the 3rd floor of the apartment building, was a widow. I just recently found out my grandfather was actually the cantor of the organist of the shul across the street from us. But it's just part of my life. And what was interesting, as I say, it took me all these years to realize it, why they didn't like me. As I said, my grandmother was a seamstress. She wasn't going to let some stranger look at my clothes and say, oh, the poor kid. I went to England dressed like a princess, which didn't make good friends for the people I went to who didn't have the money to dress their children the way I was dressed. But it took me a little while, and I did the best I could and adjusted. Was sent to the country. They took me to church, but they realized it didn't do any good, so they stopped that. But London was not bombed at that particular time. The parents of these children said, what? Why should we send our children away? Nothing is happening. So they brought their children home, which I was too. One of my favorite stories of my whole life is what I'm going to tell you now. We went back to London, and then the bombing of London started, so we were evacuated to the country again. Have any of you ever lived in a mansion? I have asked this question of some school children, and they don't even know what a mansion is. All I can tell you is lots and lots and lots of rooms, bathrooms, fancy rooms. The government put us in different places. This in a town, a little town in the south of England called Salcombe, which is near Plymouth. And this lady, and by the way, her title was as lady, and we lived with the servants. She had decided she would take 4 children in. We lived with the servants in the servants' quarters, but Lady Waring was really the lady of the manor. She had a chauffeur. She had a gardener. She had an assistant gardener. She had a cook. She had an assistant cook. She had a housemaid, a parlor maid, a personal maid, and here are these children from London. By that time I was speaking English too. What do you do with somebody whose name is Lady Clementine Waring? Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling. Well, the parlor maid came out and said like this, her ladyship wishes for me to tell you, while you are a guest in her home, you are not allowed to sing that song. I've told this to many people, and believe it or not, of all the things I tell them about, this is the one thing they always remember, Lady Waring and her song. Lived there about 2 years, and we were sent back to London. We didn't know why until the war was over. The American Navy was coming into this small town. 2,000 sailors. And we found out after the war why the children there were sent back to London to their relatives. Because that little town was too small to have 2,000 sailors practicing and learning about the invasion of Europe, which they were going to be doing. And so we had to go back to London. My sister and I, after 4 years, were finally reunited. And there was a very nice lady and her husband and their daughter who had a relative that my other cousin was living with. And they said, okay, we'll take you and your sister. They were wonderful to us. One night, the air raid sirens went off. By the way, the man of the house was a cab driver. And he came home and the sirens are going. He said, I'm not going to go to bed yet, but I don't want to sit here alone. Come on downstairs, everybody. They came downstairs, meeting me as well, of course. Came downstairs, and there was a bomb. And it dropped on the roof of the house. Luckily, my sister had not stayed in bed. She had a very small bedroom, and in England in those years, they didn't have built-in cupboards. So everybody had a dresser or a wardrobe or something to keep your clothes in. The bomb fell right on the street. And the blast from the bomb made the roof collapse this way. The man of the house had insisted that we all come downstairs and keep him company. That saved my sister's life because the roof collapsed and it fell right on the bed where she would have been sleeping. So we were saved that night, but another mansion covered. In the meantime, we got letters from my parents. They got as far as Budapest, Hungary. They managed to escape out of Germany, got to Budapest. Good thing that this man decided he didn't want to sit up alone, because the way the roof collapsed, my sister would have died if she had been in bed. But we managed and we got along okay. The people I went to school with, afterwards, when there was a reunion, they said, we thought you were really, really rich. I said, why do you say that? You had clothes that were much prettier than ours, and you lived in that big house. Well, we didn't live in Lady Waring's mansion. We actually lived in a house that was given to the evacuees to stay in while they were away from their homes. So my life was changed, and we were in London, as I say, for a little while longer, and then taken back. And then I had a problem. I was living in a Christian home. They were very good to me, but I sure didn't go to services, and I had no Hebrew teacher to teach me. But things got very, very bad in London. The sirens would go off every night, and it was the rockets. The Germans were sending rockets into London, and if you listened and heard the motor, you felt okay, but you knew that as the minute that noise stopped, a few seconds later there would be a great big bang. At 13, I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But I got through that. The refugee committee took care of me in sending me to Cambridge. It was wartime, no feuding between Cambridge and Oxford. And there was no U of M in Cambridge. But we lived safely. I did go back to a reunion once, London, and all these girls said to me, "We always thought you were such a rich person." I said, "Me? Rich?" They said, "Well, the big house, the big estate, all those servants." But I didn't tell them that I was a refugee. I just said, no, that's how I live. My parents, in the meantime, were picked up. My mother wrote us a very short letter saying my father had been picked up, but she didn't know what happened to him. And she did the best that she could. We never heard from my mother again. My mother has disappeared. And every year, my sister and I would write a letter to the refugee committee or whatever the name of the committee is. And every year we get the same letter. "Dear Mrs. Maniker, we are sorry to tell you we have not been able to find your mother. We don't know what happened to my mother. We certainly think that she is alive, or was. I think she most likely is not alive anymore. My father, we know, was picked up, put into one of the camps. Then he was put in another camp. He was sent on a death march. He died just before the war was over. My sister and I came here to Detroit because we had an aunt and uncle living here. I was 16. At first I felt very proud of myself. I know shorthand and typing, I'll get it. My shorthand and typing was English shorthand and typing, which meant the letters were different. And my shorthand meant absolutely nothing to me. And I got a job. I bet you none of you have this kind of a job. I became a counter girl at the cleaner. $29 a week. My sister and I split the bills. We got kitchen privileges. And we managed. My sister became friends with my uncle's bookkeeper. My sister met the bookkeeper's friend, and within 1 year of coming to America, my sister and brother-in-law were married. We did the best we could. I stayed in a room and rented a room and managed. And my sister and I basically split our bills, and we managed okay. I sometimes think it's not real what I'm living, but at the same time, where I lived, and I'm sure none of you have ever heard of Southfield, and none of you ever lived around 10 Mile and Greenfield, but I was a den mother, I was a room mother, I was a Brownie leader, I was a Cub Scout leader, and my husband and I managed, though I must admit, I've said it more than once, there was a reason why I married an engineer. When something needed fixing, I didn't know how to do it, but my husband did. And we lived there. My husband passed away a few years ago. I have a son and 2 daughters. And I was one of the most fortunate and luckiest people you'd ever want to meet. Because when I married my husband, I got a family. You have to realize I was 8 years old when I stopped having parents. When I went to England, the mail between Germany and England stopped. There was a war. And we did the best we could. But my sister got married, and I got married. And as I always tell people, there was a reason why I married an engineer. I got things fixed. I'm not a fixer, but my husband was. I was very lucky. And I have a tremendous amount to be grateful for. I now live in a different place, in mirror apartments. Some of you might have relatives who stay there, and all of us do the best we can. I'm at the point where I do the best I can, and then when I find I'm starting to feel sorry for myself, I walk off into a corner for a few moments and say a little prayer of thankfulness and gratefulness of where and how I ended up. And like a real Jewish mother, I even have a son who's a doctor. A little bit of everything. But thank you for listening to me, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Edith.
You're welcome.
Let's see. I know some of our kids may have some questions. So, sixth graders, questions you might have after hearing from Edith and her story, as powerful as that is. And thank you again, because I think it's remarkable the things we experience in life and the frustrations we may have at times, and knowing what you went through when you were this age, right? I mean, my friends here are 11 and 12 years old. I'm 14, and so just immaturity, and so that knowing what you went through is such an inspiration to all of us. So for the people who might not have heard Joe's question, what was life like in Germany before you left Germany on the kinder transport?
I'll be more than happy to tell you. As I said, red hair, blue eyes, I don't look Jewish. Maybe I did at 8 years old, I don't think so. Very much a part of my life is Kristallnacht. We lived on the 4th floor of our apartment building. My grandmother lived on the 3rd floor. So I was surrounded by family at least. And as I say, I didn't have to worry about my looks, because with the red hair and the blue eyes, nobody bothered me at all. But we had very, very many restrictions. And I also have to tell you, I have so much to be grateful for. And my parents saved our lives by sending us to England. But every once in a while, I just go off in a corner by myself, not to cry, but to say a prayer of thanksgiving for being saved.
Wow, thank you. What was school like when you went to class in England?
Well, I know you've never been to school with a rabbi. I'm teasing. The law in Germany, was changed, and Jewish children were not allowed in public school. So all of our teachers were Jewish. Most of them were rabbis. And until I went to England on the kinder transport, I really didn't, it was just basic school, except that we didn't have the Gentile teachers anymore. But we did the best we could. And it might sound like bragging, but I'm really not, it's the truth. Jewish people believe in education. So as you are growing up, even though you're confined and left in a special school, you're still going to keep on learning and following the rules that the teachers give you.
That's very true. Education is important and has always been. You know, one of the first thing that was established in the displaced person camps throughout Europe after the Holocaust, the first thing they did was establish schools. Before they had synagogues or anything like that, they put schools together for the children who had survived. Another question.
I have to tell you a story about Edith that she's not sharing with you, which is really important, is that Edith was a major volunteer for the Holocaust Memorial Center. And there's a program called ARSP, which is from Germany, and they're young people that come to the United States and to throughout the world to basically pay tribute for all the horrible things that happened in Germany. And one of the young men that came to Detroit to work at the Holocaust Memorial Center was a man named Richard Bachman. And Edith approached Richard and said, "You're from Leipzig, I'm from Leipzig. I don't think we're gonna get along. It's gonna be really hard for me to do this." Edith also raised her children saying, "We will never buy German products." Mercedes, that was just not the thing, right, Edith? I'm telling all them. Okay, so, and Edith was very honest with Richard, and Richard was here for a year, went back to Edith's hometown, and what's that?
He was wonderful.
Yeah, he was wonderful. It was actually should be a PBS special. But he went to her old house, where Edith, her old apartment complex, and there's such a thing called stumbling stones. And artists came to all throughout Europe and said, you know, these...
Stumpelstein.
I'm saying in English, stumbling stones. So what they literally are, they're on the floor or on the walls of buildings where Jews lived, and basically where they were born and where they were when they got shipped to concentration camps. And Richard said to Edith, please come back to Germany. Now she had never been back to Germany, nor did she ever want to go back to Germany. And Richard said, come back, and we want to do an honor and put stumbling stones on the ground where you and your family was. And Edith said, no. And then Richard said, yes. And then Edith said, okay, I'll come. And
I don't know the name of the organization, but really and truly these are young, working people who are really and truly working for peace. They are a wonderful group, and the Stumblestones are very emotional when you look at it, if it includes part of you. It's a sign of a brick, and on it says, lived here. And that is dug up, they dug up a little bit, the apartment buildings and the private homes. They buried this brick, which gives the name of the people who lived there, if available, where and when they died. And the brick is put right next to the house where the people lived.
I have a photo if anyone wants to see.
it's amazing. So what they did have is a whole service. Edith brought two of her kids to Germany, to Leipzig, to witness that, and had the service. And Edith also could probably tell you that she went to the synagogue that she grew up. Believe it or not, that synagogue was not destroyed during the war because it was next to a church or next to other Gentile buildings and stuff like that. So that synagogue, and they honored her by going, and they had a whole Friday night service, and she remembers sitting where, it's, by the way, most of the people in Leipzig, the Jewish community is mostly Russian Jews have come. So I think they did it in 3 languages, right? They did it in Russian, Hebrew, and English. And Edith was able to sit where she sat with her grandfather in a little, in the little place where she would hang out for services, which I think is really inspirational. So the fact that this woman at this age can change her mind in terms of going back to her homeland to being is just a credit to who she is.
When was that, Edith?
10 years ago?
How do you know when?
When they went?
Yeah.
It was a while ago. That's not exactly how the story went, though. So they do put these stones in front of various so many people were taken from their homes. So Richard worked for years trying to get my family's names on these stones. And the only reason Bucky agreed to go was for this specifically. And so my aunt and uncle went also. It is true, the synagogue where Bucky went was across the street from her apartment building. And the businesses on either side is, I guess, like a strip mall, for lack of a better word, were owned by Christians. And so because of that, during Kristallnacht, which I know was the question earlier, the synagogue was not burned. So they took, one of the memories that she still has usually is that they took everything out of the synagogue into the street to burn it. But it was one of the only ones that wasn't burned because of that. So it took years for Richard to get them to put in these particular stones. And so when Bucky went, she also she did not want to travel and sightsee. That wasn't the point of the trip. So yes, she changed her mind in those terms, but it was for a very specific purpose to go. And so she also has a stone there. So it's all of my relatives who lived in that particular.
Stumble. Stones.
People, not just those who died, but people who were
Right.
forcibly removed from their homes. So all through Europe, you see these now. It started in Germany, but all through, I've seen them in Denmark and in Holland and in France, and I've been there as well.
And the point of putting that in the ground, specifically, and they do a whole ceremony with it, is that it's supposed to stop you as you're walking, to remember that it was just a part of life, as opposed to being somewhere that it's more of a memorial that you wouldn't walk on. And people go every year to clean them and take care of them. The idea is that the people who live in that building will take care of those stones now. And so if we're calling them sort of stones and bricks, I can show you, but they're basically gold squares that are.
But they call them tumble stones, that you'll actually sort of tumble over them, right?
Tumble, because
Yeah.
you're supposed to walk and then suddenly you see it unexpectedly.
Right.
Oh, look, that's.
It looks like a cobblestone, a little 3-inch by 3-inch cobblestone that's in the ground. They take one out, and they put this brass, it's a stamped brass cobblestone that's about 10 inches deep.
I don't know how deep they are
It's
actually.
really
It's
deep,
yeah.
it's about 3 inches, and they put that down in the ground.
Please.
I just thought in terms of the Stumpelstein, the artist puts it right next to the place where they lived so that they remember it. But also, on the day that we had this done, they actually had a newspaper from Leipzig come and look at these strange people. But at the same time, Richard, who is still in Ann Arbor studying, told us that those young people who worked for this organization are still doing it. And I had a question for them in terms of, I felt a little uncomfortable. We had this beautiful ceremony and then we were going to go away. And these women came towards me with some flowers and I said, oh my gosh, the last thing in the world I need right now is some flowers. But they walked right past me and put the flowers down on the bricks. And from what Richard has told me, every year on Kristallnacht, they clean the stone, they light a yard site, and they say Kaddish. And these are non-Jewish people.
You said you were 7 years old, right? When you were 7 years old when you went on the kinder transport? And so and then you were 16 when you came to America?
Yep.
How many years was it before you got to America from the end of the war?
Well, the war was over in June, and then we made arrangements.
Fairly soon after?
But my sister was married by that time, so they made it, and my aunt and uncle in the church. Actually, one of my aunts who lived here was her husband had been the rabbi in The town across the street from Port Huron.
Sorry.
Sarnia. And what were you still in Germany for Kristallnacht, or had you? Okay, so Kindertransport took place. Kristallnacht was 1930.
9, because I think
9? 39?
it already begun occupying other countries.
Yeah, 39.
There were 6 relatives who got out on the kinder transport. They went on different ones. Bubby was on the last one. And my Auntie Paula, who was the oldest, who was 8 years older than Bubby. Bubby was 8 when she was on the kinder transport. She was sort of responsible for getting all of them. Because her dad was like, some of them were with Christian families, but that we should all be with Jewish families.
Edith's sister.
Yeah,
That's right.
Auntie Paula. Right, there were 6. So she got all 6 of them to the U.S.
I don't know, I can't hear what
She said, "Oh, all 6 of the your sister and the cousins from the Kindertransport coming to the United States after the war were able to get here too." Well, you know,
The thing is this, there was a book written, it said 6 from Leipzig. But these are my younger cousins, and she was the youngest to come to England on the kinder transport. She was 7 months old, never knew her parents.
wow.
And I found out something after the war that was quite interesting. My father was what they called a printer and compositor. And please don't ask me to explain it because I don't know. But at the same time, my father did some work that I found about not too long ago. And I was quite amazed. My father took German books, translated them into Hebrew, and mailed them to Palestine, or was then Palestine, so that people would have books to read in the language they understood.
Wow. Esty?
Just wondering, was it just one transport? Like there was just one day and they just always...
No. So 10,000 total children were on the Kindertransport, and it was a number of weeks it took to get it together.
And then were there
My
adults?
Auntie Paula went out on, I think, the very first one, and was there, so she was there for a while, like before my mother.
The name of the movie that we showed the kids a part of last week is called
Into the Arms of Strangers.
Into the Arms of Strangers. It's on HBO, I believe.
It's on, yeah.
It's a documentary. Amazon Prime. So, and it's not long, but it tells that story and has some of the facts
It's
in
more
it.
about really a network of transportation that this group.
It's like
this
the Underground Railroad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
more like the Underground Railroad, that's right.
And it wasn't just German, there were Austrian Jews who were part of it, because the movie we watched focuses mostly on Vienna and the Jewish population there.
What's interesting too, and actually we just learned this recently, because Jim had the thought in house, that they had permission to go, so they weren't like sneaking out in the dead of night.
Right. There were major train lines, and the Nazis knew the trains were, so
And why did they let him?
why they let them?
I mean,
The final solution wasn't until 1942, right? So the idea that the goal was
They
to
were
murder,
happy to get rid of them.
right, just to make it Juden free, make Germany, Austria free of any Jews.
But they did not allow adults to go.
Only
They
children.
weren't allowed, no adults.
No adults.
And the reason Bubby and my cousins were able to get out because my uncle had been a cantor, or excuse me, I guess my great uncle, her uncle had been a cantor, and was sort of more tied in, and that's how they were able to get out. That was the relationship.
Yeah. Are you still able to speak German? Was the question, so y'all could hear.
No.
No?
It isn't as if I was a teenager. I was 16 years old. I had never worked. I couldn't get a job in an office. My shorthand and typing was no good, and besides, they needed somebody who really knew what to do in an office. So, as I said, I became a counter girl at a cleaner's, and it wasn't the biggest paycheck in the world, but my sister and I split the bills, and that's what we lived on.
You still have more of a British accent than you do a German accent.
I don't have a German.
Right, your accent's really
I don't
British.
speak German.
And if it,
Right, I mean, she was so young when she left, so by the time she left England, she passed that question. She really didn't speak any more German. And I don't remember it, but like my mom and probably Danny remember that like she spoke with a very strong British accent when they were growing up. So
she's saying your British accent's always been very strong when you were younger, when, no.
I used to get sick of hearing it. I told her I came from Texas.
Did you hear that? Mindy, she said that she'd get tired of people saying she had a British accent. She told people she's actually from Texas. So, hence the Calvins. So,
Mindy would have corrected them.
she used to have like my mom and aunt and uncle stand up when like, the Queen came on. And actually this is very interesting too. So they had an event. She went back many times to England for various like, Tinder transport events. And there was one, my grandfather is still alive, so at least 13 years ago now. And like she met at the time Prince Charles because they had a whole big event and
you met Prince Charles?
That's right.
Actually, I did.
I'm sorry, King Charles.
King Charles III.
That's right. So,
I went to London on a reunion for Kindertransport, and the Prince honored us and came to the reception, and I actually shook hands with them. But he forgot me by the time he became king.
The other sort of really interesting thing, my mom at one point actually wrote a letter to the Queen because my Bubby had always made them like stand up when the Queen came on TV or anything out of respect for the Queen because that's who saved her life. And so my mom wrote a letter. This is also, I can't remember, I think my baby was still alive too, so at least 13 years ago, and said, you know, like, thank you, you saved my mom's life. And they normally, you know, it says like on the website, like no one will respond to you, like she'll send letters. And my mom did get a response actually, saying specifically like, I'm her lady in waiting, and the Queen wanted me to respond to this specifically, and we're so glad to hear that. And I don't remember the detail.
the letter your daughter sent to the Queen, thanking the Queen for saving your life, and the response you got.
Beautiful thank you back.
Yeah,
She really,
it's amazing.
Really is lovely.
Can I ask you one? So, Edith, as we close this, the last two times you did this, you had advice for all of us. Do you remember the advice?
For those who didn't hear in the back, what Mindy was asking of Edith was, Edith, as she's spoken to our groups before, has often had some advice for all of us as 11, 12-year-olds or our community here. Your advice for us from your experience.
I'm not a good advice giver, but I have to tell you, in terms of your parents and your relatives, how, especially the ones who, even though they grew up here, had to realize how much they had to be grateful for. And sometimes we forget that we have a lot to be grateful for. And just being able to do things, having a good life. I laugh when I say I became a counter girl and cleaners, but I had no experience in working everything. I went to school, I learned shorthand. I was terrible at that. But all I know is I have to tell you this little story for just 1 second. In terms of being grateful for and everything, there is a tremendous amount that we don't realize. Being able to live the way we live, we might not get everything we want, but we sure get a large percentage of it. And always remember, we get, as children, we get angry at our parents. But I can tell you from personal experience, life is lousy without them. treasure them. They're worth keeping.
Well, your message of gratitude is incredibly powerful for all of us, and to keep that perspective in our lives and everything we experience, and to learn from you in that way. And we'll always hold your message and your stories close to our heart too, forever. So thank you for your time this morning.